Rasheed Wallace was trending today, not by his full name, Rasheed Wallace. It was actually trending by Sheed because apparently he was on a podcast, Barstool Sports, a Barstool Sports podcast. Let me rephrase that. A Barstool Sports podcast. And this is what he had to say about if LeBron James were to play, and Kevin Durant. I should also throw this in. This clip is going as long as Kevin Durant. He also mentions other superstars, but this is if LeBron James and KD played during his time.
LeBron James.
In my era, he probably would have done good because with his physical stature, with him being a little bit bigger than a majority of the rest. So he probably would have held his own, but I don't think he would have been as successful as he is now. Like now is, man, you know what I mean? Like he doing it, young boy doing it. You know what I mean? So, but it was a whole different era back then, bro.
So, beast or soft?
I just told you.
Beast then.
You know, I think he would have held his own. I can't necessarily say he would have been a beast, but I think he would have held his own.
Ray Allen.
Well, Ray played during that era.
Oh my God!
I just wanted to know personally.
He's in his era. Was Ray Allen a beast or was he soft?
No. Ray Allen was a monster, dog. Ray Allen was a sharpshooter.
Like
Kevin Durant.
And in that era, I don't think he would have had too much success. Now he's a monster. In this era, he's a monster, dog.
So you don't think Kevin Durant would have been a beast?
Well, because you got to look at it. Back then, you had a lot more posting. The game was inside out. Now it's outside in.
Mm-hmm.
So that was Rasheed Wallace on that podcast. The co-host, not the main host, but I will say the co-host, if you were not picking up that scent, it was pretty much him oblivious. Because he was like, what about Ray Allen? She was like, Ray Allen played during Rasheed Wallace's time. He was with the Milwaukee Bucks, right? And then there was also, shortly after the Kevin Durant answer, he also asked this one question where it's like, okay, now I get it. This guy doesn't know anything about basketball. So, Rasheed Wallace, this is a guy that happened to play against LeBron James. Not just for a year. It's not like how long Kobe was playing against Michael Jordan, right? It wasn't for like a few years. It was actually for 8 years. So according to @NickVanExit, Rasheed Wallace 1995, 2013, LeBron James 2003 to present. Yeah, I'm sure LeBron would have struggled in those 8 seasons before he entered the league under Sheed's era. What is Rasheed talking about? In the 90s? I'm sorry, but I feel as if don't get me wrong, I love the 90s. The 90s basketball was my favorite. 90s music was also the best.
Movies are good too.
90s movies was amazing. Pretty much everything in the 90s was great. 90s was a great era. But am I going to say that the game of basketball stopped there primal? That 90s basketball was not meant to evolve and that like we passed our peak? I'm not going to say that. Because the entire game was meant to evolve. And that evolve period happened to be because of a person by the name of LeBron James. 2003, there was a torch being waited to be handed to another person. Now, Kobe Bryant picked it up. I'm not going to lie. Look, Kobe Bryant was there, but Kobe Bryant was also a disciple of the 90s. So I'm saying someone between the 2000s to now. LeBron James is somebody that had to pick up the torch and make the sport what it is. You can... And this is another thing. I've said this before on this podcast. Not everybody has to be the greatest. We can even create our own categories of who is the greatest, right? Who is the greatest shooter? Steph Curry. That guy revolutionized the game to what it is today. Without Steph, nobody will be shooting as many threes as they are today, right? Steph Curry might have learned that from Ray Allen, who was also part of the 90s that we just talked about. Who is the greatest guy for getting triple doubles? We could say Russell Westbrook, right? Before that, LeBron James, right? They probably got it from Irvin Magic Johnson.
Jason Kidd.
It was also funny too. I was thinking about it earlier today because Rondo's back, right? Everybody forgets that Rondo was like Mr. Triple Double with the Boston Celtics. That was so fun to watch him get the triple-double. Well, maybe not for Laker fans, but for the NBA fan, it was fun seeing Rondo get like a triple-double, even though he struggled to get across the 10-point. That was always the part that he struggled at, was the points. It was never the rebounds or assists. It was like, can I get this 10th point? Let me shoot a free throw. Brick. Okay. Luckily, I have his second free throw.
Hakeem used to get him like regularly with blocks.
I think is it him or is it David Robinson that has a quadruple-double?
David Robinson's got the quad.
Yeah. So it's Kobe Bryant. He is the greatest of the 2000s. This is coming from someone that would fight as long as I did. I am more of a Tim Duncan supporter than I am Kobe Bryant, but when you look at what Kobe Bryant was in the 2000s, how can you argue against him? He won back-to-back rings with a team that wasn't as strong as it was when he got the three-peat. So there's different categories that you can make for each player. Rasheed Wallace wasn't even a memorable big man in the 90s. Who did you have in the 90s? Shaquille O'Neal. Sabonis even. He was the fifth person on the Portland Trailblazers. You had Tim Duncan. You had David Robinson. You had Sean Kemp. You had so many guys who were actual bigs or just athletic bigs. You had Charles Barkley for most of the 90s. So when Rasheed Wallace is saying this, I don't think he actually meant that LeBron James can't play in the 90s. I think Rasheed Wallace is holding on to something that happened in his career where he's bitter about LeBron James doing something to him. We can go on to the other tweets. I forgot about the other tweets. This is from Ralph_Mason Jr. Rasheed crap on all recent... He didn't say crap, by the way. Rasheed crap on all the recent NBA superstars, saying they couldn't hang in his era is only to follow up by praising the Morris twins. Yeah, because the Morris twins are from Philadelphia. So it's Rasheed Wallace. This is from past guests here on Fear LA, the pettiest LA. The old heads hate for no reason. Y'all played in the same era. It really is sad. I think this is another example of Scottie Pippen.
We see this in not only every sport, but we just see this in life generally. I mean, how many times have you heard like, "Oh, these millennials"?
Okay,
it's like every previous generation is going to take issue and think that they're either had a tougher time or a more difficult time or even a better time than the generation that follows.
This is like the common joke. I'm glad you brought that up because this is like the common joke where it's just like you hear the boomer say like, "Oh, damn you kids! I had a house back in my day." It's like, how much did a house cost, Grandpa? How much did a house cost during your time?
How much did that college education cost you there, guy?
Yeah. Did you marry your high school sweetheart? And then did you guys end up married for over 50 years because she didn't realize she actually had a freedom of choice to leave you? Or was it because now you realize that today is more about independence and it's actually harder to find a person to stay in a relationship where you both are committed and you're both willing to take risks and you're both willing to bring something to the table financially, mental health wise, just in different areas, right? That's the same thing with this going on in sports. You see a lot of people go like, well, back in my day was better. Bill Russell still thinks he's the greatest of all time. Bill, I'm sorry, but you would have not got past the 80s, let alone the 90s, in what they had to offer for the centers. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I feel as if this is to me, Michael Jordan, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, those are like the arguments you make for greatest of all time. Those are the arguments you make for greatest of all time. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Michael Jordan. Why? Because they played in multiple eras. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar dominated the 70s. He was there in the 80s. That was great. Michael Jordan, he was in the shadows of the 80s. He wasn't in the forefront because that was Magic dominating with Bird. Dr. J was the feature of the 80s, right? In the 90s is when Michael Jordan just took it by the throat and was like, this is my time. This is where I get to shine. So, going back to what I was trying to say, LeBron James, he's a GOAT of the millennium.
What's really funny to me, too, Zach, sorry to interrupt, is that this coming from Sheed saying that it was an inside out and now it's an outside in league. Sheed was like the first stretch four.
Yeah,
I mean, he was kind of the first big man who would actually stand on the perimeter and shoot jump shots. And so I can understand if, like, you know, like an old banger out there, you know, like Greg Ostertag with some stuff like this. But I mean, Rasheed's the last person to really comment on this because he necessarily wasn't a physical player. He was intimidating because he was an insane person, but he wasn't a banger down there.
And this is another thing. Like, okay, I feel as if a lot of his technicals, because that's what, if any of you guys remember at this point, Rasheed Wallace during his playing career, the most thing he was known for was his technicals. So when I remember about Rasheed Wallace getting technicals, a lot of those things was because he was sensitive. He was fragile mentally. And this is coming from a North Carolina fan. I grew up watching him, and this is a guy that I did like, but at the same time, I do have to admit, this guy, when it came to technicals, it would be over the slightest thing.
It wasn't technicals because he was, you know, slapping dudes up the head or committing hard flagrant fouls. It was technicals because he was crying at the refs.
Because if this is my favorite technical, by the way, was the one where there's actually two. The ball don't lie one was the second one, but my first one of all time is where the ref, like, they just actually have the ref mic, and the Rasheed Wallace comes looking at him again. And so as soon as he's like staring at the mic or the ref yells, technical. And you see Steve Smith, who is his teammate at the time, he comes up. He was like, no. He was like, please. He was like, nope, I told him. He goes, I told him. He kept on trying to stare at me. He didn't listen. I kept on. So that whole intimidation thing was actually a derivative of him being sensitive. Like him, like, you can't do that. You just got to pick up. You pretty much threw your game, the team's game, out of the bag because, again, you just didn't want to be mature enough to stay on the court and let the ref be alone. So when it comes to Rasheed, that was him being an old head. That was him being, I don't know, it felt, again, like Scottie Pippen when Scottie Pippen said, like, you know, Phil Jackson was racist. Just like, dude, why are you trying to make yourself relevant? That doesn't need to be necessary. And then Paul Pierce today. Did you hear what happened with Paul Pierce? So Paul Pierce, Mike was like, I don't know. So I did put you on the spot there. Sorry. Paul Pierce did an interview with Sports Illustrated. And it was pretty much about how he left a stripper video up on Instagram of how he got fired from ESPN. And so this is what he said. I was done with them anyway. It wasn't a great fit. There's a lot of stuff over there that you can't say. And you have to talk about LeBron all the time. Okay, so when you talk about LeBron, what does that do for your show? My thumbs up. That's supposed to be your ratings. So ESPN, Fox Sports, why do you think they're always going to talk about LeBron James? Because ratings.
If you wrote for the New York Times in like 1927, you weren't like, God, I'm so tired of talking about Babe Ruth.
Yeah, exactly. And here's another thing. Okay, so I work in the sports radio business, right? The one thing in LA that you have to start off every show with is Dodgers or Lakers, depending on which one is the most. So it's always a toss-up in terms of like which one is more important of that day. If the Lakers are in the playoffs, you obviously want to lead off towards the Lakers. Or if the Dodgers are about to go in the playoffs or something exciting like a big trade, you're going to go with the Dodgers. So it's either or. But at the start of every discussion, when it's Lakers, it's LeBron James, just like how it is for Clayton Kershaw when he was in his prime, or Mookie Betts now for the Dodgers. You're always going to hit those key words that makes your ratings go up. So Paul Pierce is a bitter man because this dude who retired with the Boston Celtics had his jersey retirement the same night the Cleveland Cavaliers came into town and then whomped on his Celtics while he sat front row. That's the bitterness that continues to soil deep into his soul. So when it comes to LeBron James, it has nothing to do with having to talk about LeBron James all the time. It has to do with Paul Pierce still being the salty individual like Rasheed Wallace, like Scottie Pippen, like a lot of these dudes that get lost in the shadow of the NBA relevancy. This is what happens. We need to change it.